Good afternoon. I'm Suzanne Borden, Moment Magazine's Special Projects Manager, and I'd like to welcome you to The March Continues, the message of civil rights pioneers Martin Luther King Jr. and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, with special guests Susannah Heschel and Richard Michelson. Today's Zoominar kicks off the first annual Martha's Vineyard Jewish Book Festival, held in partnership with Moment Magazine, the Chilmark Library, and the Martha's Vineyard Hebrew Center. We hope you will join us tomorrow for a moment of inspiration, the life and legacy of Elie Wiesel, with Moment Editor-in-Chief Nadine Epstein. Nadine is actually here today along with Tracy Thorpe, Programs Coordinator at the Chilmark Library, to say a few words before we get started. Nadine?
Hi. We are thrilled to be kicking off our new Martha's Vineyard Jewish Book Festival today. Well, this festival was supposed to take place in person, but we're delighted to be bringing it to you on Zoom. Our mission is to bring books on Jewish topics to the Vineyard each summer. And I want to say thank you to Tracy Thorpe at the Chilmark Library, also to Ebba Hierta, and to the Martha's Vineyard Hebrew Center, who are also partnering with us, and to Rabbi Karen Breutman and Sharon Kleinberg. And to Amy Schwartz, who's our book editor, and Moment's book editor and opinion editor, who lives on the Vineyard. And to this year's authors, thank you so much for being there. And Rich and Susannah, and also we're going to have writer Amy Bickel and cartoonist Bob Meinkoff. And to you, thank you for joining us today and throughout this week. We also have big plans for next year. Hopefully we'll be there in person, but if not, we'll be here in our virtual happy zone on Zoom. So have a wonderful day.
Tracy, can you take yourself off mute?
Hi, everybody. Hope you can hear me. I'm Tracy Thorpe. I'm the programs coordinator at the Chilmark Library, and I'd like to take this opportunity to say thank you to Nadine for allowing us to co-host this exciting series of talks. I've known of Rich Michelson because of his gallery in Northampton, but I never knew of the scope and subject matter of his authorship, and it's really wonderful. We're honored to have the both of you here to speak today, so thank you so much.
Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, Nadine. Please note that today's session is being recorded and the link will be available later this week. We will take some of your questions at the end of the program, so please type them in the Q&A box. Now for today's session. Susannah Heschel is the Eli M. Black Distinguished Professor and Chair of the Jewish Studies Program at Dartmouth College. She is the author of Abraham Geiger and the Jewish Jesus and the Aryan Jesus, Christian Theologians and the Bible in Nazi Germany. Susannah also published a book on Jewish scholarship on Islam, and with Umar Rayad co-edited The Muslim Reception of European Orientalism. She has also edited Moral Grandeur and Spiritual Audacity, Essays of Abraham Joshua Heschel. The recipient of 4 honorary doctorates, she has held research grants from the Carnegie, Ford, and Guggenheim Foundations, as well as the National Humanities Center and the Institute for Scholars in Berlin. Richard Michelson's books have been listed among the 10 best of the year by the New York Times, Publishers Weekly, and the New Yorker, and among the best dozen of the decade by Amazon. He has received 2 Sidney Taylor Gold Medals from the Association of Jewish Libraries, 3 Skipping Stones Multicultural Book Awards, the 2018 National Jewish Book Award, as well as the 2019 Samuel Minot Jones Award for Lifetime Literary Achievement. A 3-time Massachusetts Book Award finalist, Richard's work was chosen to represent the Commonwealth at the 2018 Library of Congress National Book Festival. He has served 2 times as Poet Laureate of Northampton, Massachusetts, and spent summers at his gingerbread cottage in Oak Bluffs, Martha's Vineyard. So please welcome Susannah Heschel and Rich Michelson. Though I'm going to start off with a question for Rich. I know that you have written a book, Across the Alley, about 2 boys, one Jewish, one Black, who keep their friendship secret, and as well as the book that we're talking about today, As Good as Anybody, about the friendship of Martin Luther King Jr. and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. What was the inspiration for writing these stories about friendship, race, and religion?
Well, first of all, thank you, and thank you for inviting me. Thank you for everyone watching. You can tell that I am in my little gingerbread cottage on Martha's Vineyard in Oak Bluffs. If I turn to the side, you'll see it's a beautiful day out, and we had nice beach weather today. And if you didn't know what was going on in the world, you would think you were in paradise here. For me, I also want to say it's an absolute honor to be talking with Susannah. I think we first actually met on Martha's Vineyard when you were speaking at the Hebrew Center here. And I am a big fan not only of your dad's work, but your own writings. And for many of you in the watching who don't know, Susannah is the reason you put an orange on your Seder plate on Passover. So maybe we can get to that a little later. But start with why my books. So I grew up in East New York, Brooklyn. If anybody, you can clap on screen if anybody else was born and grew up there. And when I was born, East New York was pretty much a 95% Jewish neighborhood. By the time I left, we were one of the very few white families still in the neighborhood. And so racial issues have always been important to me. And I wrote the book Across the Alley at a point when our neighborhood was about 50-50. It's about an African-American boy and a Jewish boy, and who's are not allowed to play with each other, but their bedroom windows face each other, and at night they become best friends. And it's about whether they will bring their friendship out into the open. As a quick side note, I want to say that already I'm using old-fashioned terms, because when I say an African-American boy and a Jewish boy, I'm leaving out the fact that there are many Jews of color, and yet that is the dynamic that I wrote about when I was growing up. I also, in the book, the two boys bring their friendship out into the open. I just spoiled the ending for everyone. But in real life, myself and the other boy were scared to bring our friendship out into the open. And in fact, would tease each other when we were in school and not between ourselves. And I started thinking when I was writing that book about why I had why growing up, I did not have the courage of my convictions. I knew what was right and what was wrong and didn't always follow that. And I started to think about people who did reach across the aisle and had the courage of their convictions. And the people who first came to me, of course, were Abraham Joshua Heschel and Martin Luther King Jr., who reached across the aisle. And I'd like to just start with a quote from each and then talk to Susannah a little bit about it. But my book opens with an epigraph from Martin Luther King Jr. I solemnly pledge to uphold the fair name of Jews, not only because we need their friendship, and surely we do, but mainly because bigotry in any form is an affront to us all. And that is followed by a quote by Abraham Joshua Heschel. 100 years ago, the emancipation was proclaimed. It is time for the white man to strive for self-emancipation, to set himself free of bigotry. And I had a tough time actually narrowing down which quote to use. My publisher said to start with one. Heschel also said, racism is man's gravest threat to man, the maximum hatred for a minimum reason. And finally, I was looking at his statement that it's easier for Israelites to cross the Red Sea than for Negroes to cross certain university campuses. So all these things came together, and I thought that their friendship and their childhood would make an interesting book. So I started reading more and more about them. And I turned first to Susannah Heschel's books. on her dad. And Susannah, I'm curious. I've always wanted to. So when your dad died, you were how old?
I was in my teens. Yeah.
You were in your teens. And were you aware at the time of the groundbreaking friendship between King and your dad? Was it something that was spoken in your house every day, that, or was it something you came to later because he died
Yeah.
not that
So
long
let
ago?
me say that my father's, first of all, it's great to be with you. And those of you who are in Martha's Vineyard, you're so lucky. It's a wonderful, beautiful place. I was there just one time when we first met. That was ages ago because my children were, I think, still toddlers at that point. But I would say that my father's friendship with Dr. King was very important to my father. And the civil rights movement was important. So it was something that was discussed at our dinner table. I'm an only child, and my parents would take me with them when they went to hear my father give a lecture. My father often spoke with Dr. King after they first met, which was in 1963. They would go to Jewish organizations, for example, and give lectures together, and they talked about racism. They talked about Israel. They talked about the importance of releasing Soviet Jews out of the Soviet Union so that they could practice Judaism. There were many topics that they discussed. They also talked a lot about the war in Vietnam, which is something that disturbed my father greatly because that war was deteriorating. It was losing any sense of political and military accomplishment and had simply become a war against civilians.
Let me just say that that's actually how I first learned about your dad, not through his Jewish lectures, but when I was waiting, sitting in a college room watching the lottery and waiting for my number to come up and planning my trip to Canada at the time. Maybe these days we're looking at Canada again. But your dad gave me both arguments and courage.
That's wonderful. I'm so glad. And the question at the time was whether Dr. King should speak out against the war, because it would certainly alienate Congress and the president and result in many attacks against him from other civil rights leaders. And he did speak out, and it was under the auspices of an organization that my father started called Clergy and Laymen Concerned About Vietnam. And that took place in Riverside Church in April 1967. I was there that night listening. But these were very important moral issues in my home growing up. They weren't political, they were moral. What was the right thing to do? So yes, it was very much a part of my life as a child. And I had the opportunity to meet other civil rights leaders who were friends with my father and worked with him. And that was great. Those are friendships that have lasted to this day.
We tend to look back. I'm wondering if we're looking back in that time through rose-colored glasses at all. We tend to look at your dad and King as these great icons, in some ways saints, and we forget, I think, the objections to their reaching out politically, reaching out together. This was not a popular thing at the time. Did you have a sense of their friendship being a pariah? I'm glad there wasn't Twitter then. You could think of the hate mail they'd be getting. But how did that?
My father would never use Twitter. Yes, I understand what you're saying. And I think you've touched on something important, which is that when my father, for example, went to Selma to march, and he went by himself. That is, he didn't have colleagues and good friends who were going with him or who thanked him when he came back. On the contrary, he was very, very much alone in what he stood for. And it was really only many years later, I remember after his death, I would say probably around 1980, that Jews started saying to me, it's wonderful that your father marched in Selma and that he knew Dr. King. And now, let me just say that photograph of my father with Dr. King in the front row of the marchers, and they're wearing the flowered leis that one of the marchers from Hawaii had brought, that photograph is iconic, and Jews love that photograph, and it's in many Jewish history books. And I think it is important. It's important for us to think about that friendship. It's on the cover of your book, exactly. Yes, but I also think it has to be a challenge. That is, it shouldn't be a photograph of Jews say, look what we did, isn't that wonderful? I think we have to take the civil rights movement as a challenge to us today, because they marched for voting rights, and those voting rights are being eroded today. What are we doing about that?
It's interesting when you say that, because what I hear from, and we'll go from the march to what's happening today, I think, will come up. But one of the things that we think about is this great friendship between Blacks and Jews in the civil rights era that has fractured in many ways. And we wonder why that fractured. I hear some Jews saying that, we weren't appreciated, that look how many Jews went down to march, were maimed, were killed, and then later they were pushed, their voice was pushed out. And what I've learned, I think, from your dad and from you is that we don't do things for praise. And in fact, I'm reading your dad's book on Maimonides right now, because I'm writing a little bit about Maimonides. And what's interesting to me is that it's we who should be appreciative for being given the opportunity to help. And I think that's, something that your dad was very, was very out about. He wasn't looking for that sort of praise. He was looking to change the world.
Yes. So I don't think the issue is, I would say this. First of all, there are many, many, many different Jewish communities. We're not all the same, with different religious views, political views, and so forth. They're different communities. And the same is true of the African American community. I will say that all of the people who worked with my father in the civil rights movement have become good friends of mine. They express gratitude in a way that I think is actually a very important lesson for all of us. That is, here it is so many years later, 50, 60 years later, and they're still saying to me, we're so grateful that your father stood with us. And I'm struck by it, because it's not often that I hear people express gratitude. And gratitude isn't something you feel, it's something that you speak and that you act on. And I think we as Jews also have that as a commandment that sometimes I feel we've neglected, to express our gratitude. And I have to say that my father always would put things in a larger historical context. So think about this for a moment. My father, as you know, grew up in Poland in a Hasidic family. He studied in Berlin, and he was living there starting in 1927 through 1938. So he was there when Hitler came to power. And what was going on? There were Christian theologians who said that the Hebrew Bible is a Jewish book and has no place in a Christian Bible in the Nazi period. How can a Nazi have a Jewish book? And they threw it out of the Bible. And they said Jesus wasn't a Jew, he was an Aryan. Then my father came to this country and he found the civil rights movement making the Hebrew Bible and Moses, the Exodus, the prophets, the central figures of the civil rights movement. Think what that meant to him as a Jew, as a refugee from Hitler. That was extraordinary. And my father was grateful and inspired. That would never have happened in Europe. So that's also very important. And I feel that for the Jews, young people who got involved in the civil rights movement in the 60s and who did, in some cases, give their lives, but they put their bodies on the line. And you know what? They had a great sense of inspiration. They felt this was the right thing to do. And my father always said that they were fulfilling a Jewish religious mission. what they were doing had a religious significance. They didn't necessarily understand that, and Jewish organizations, and my father regretted this, didn't promote this, that this is a religious meaning. This wasn't just a political act. It was an ethical and a religious act. So I think the civil rights movement helped us as Jews. It helped us restore in many ways our Bible and our pride in our Bible, and showed us what our Bible can do to a country to soften hardened hearts, to change a social atmosphere. And I think especially after the Shoah, the fact that we felt this kind of inspiration, this was healing to our souls, and very important. So yes, it was a great friendship. And I have to say, those people in the African-American community whom I know are my friends, and they embrace me as if I'm a member of their family with so much warmth. But these are also special people who trained in nonviolence. And nonviolence isn't simply standing still. Nonviolence is also a mental and emotional and ethical training in how to behave and how to think. They were extraordinary human beings. Were they saints? Yeah, I think so, actually. I think they were extraordinary. My father was an extraordinary human being. There aren't many people in this world like my father and like Dr. King and so many others. But the point is, we all have the potential to make our lives saintly in the same way, to be tzaddikim. All of us, we can if we wish. We can live our lives like that.
What would your father be making today of the Black Lives Matter movement? Would he be astounded by it? Would he see, well, finally things are coming to fruition? Would he'd be out there marching?
First of all, I think my father would have been so horrified that I would worry for the health of his heart if he saw what was going on in this country. If he saw what happened just yesterday in Kenosha, Wisconsin, that a policeman would shoot a man in his back 7, 8 times and make him now paralyzed from the waist down in front of his children. What kind of thing is this? This is pogroms, and this is what the Jews from Eastern Europe called lynchings when they came over in the turn of the century. This is a pogrom, and we went through this as Jews. We've seen pogroms. What did we do? We created Zionism, and we built a state of Israel. And frankly, when this is going on now, I think to myself also, for African Americans in this country, I don't want them to leave this country, but boy, if I were an African American, I would want to make my own country, just like the Jews made with Zionism. I don't know what to say. My father would be absolutely horrified. I would hope that he would speak to some of these police and talk to them. Somehow, who can get through to these people? They need chaplains. I believe they have chaplains, but someone needs to talk to these people. You cannot go around with a gun and kill people.
It's, yeah, I mean, with the fact that we're living through this is just, it's horrifying, and let's hope that change does come. I know personally, and this is, we talked about this a little earlier, I know some Jews who are hesitant to participate in Black Lives Matter marches because of a few words in a very large platform against Israel. We're on the Vineyard here, and people here know that Alan Dershowitz, for one, has drawn a line in the sand until Black Lives Matter removes a blood libel from their statement. Jews should not participate. I have a lot of arguments I'd like to bring out against that, but what are your feelings about that? If a friend of mine was at a Black Lives Matter movement not that long ago, and texted that they were very uncomfortable because on the stage, somebody was holding a cardboard pig with a Star of David. And they didn't know whether their presence there is showing complicity or whether the goals itself mean you stay there and these are the people you talk to. This is, Black lives are in danger. I think Jews should understand that. If they were in Russia, when, as you say, police were coming and beating them and taking their lives, and other people didn't step up because they might not have agreed with one thing or another. But what do you have thoughts on that? I'm just curious. And what do you think your father would think about that?
First of all, anti-Semitism is growing and it's rampant. And for us to just worry about one group like Black Lives Matter is to put our heads in the sand, because the anti-Semitism is coming at us around the world and from all different kinds of communities. And we very desperately need to know what to do and how to do this. It reminds me a little bit of many different fires all around us. Which fire do I put out first? Because if I go to this fire, the other one will burn out of control. So what do? We have a great organization, the Anti-Defamation League, that really has been taking an important lead for all of us, but there are other organizations as well, American Jewish Committee, etc. I think we need a major summit, and now that we have Zoom, perhaps we can all, as Jews in this country, get together and talk about this more. I don't know about a blood libel statement in the Black Lives Matter platform. That, to say, that's new to me. I know there was a statement regarding the BDS movement and that was removed. The problem is this is a movement without a particular leader. It's a kind of grassroots. Everybody's a leader. So we have millions of people. And I'm not sure if that it lends itself to the kind of conversation one can have with a leader of a movement to say, this is not acceptable. That's the problem. So what should we do? I'm not sure any of us has an answer what to do about anti-Semitism, but I also have to say, I see it, for example, in advertisements for people running for Congress, depicting their Jewish opponent with dollar bills or with a bigger nose and so forth. I see Ku Klux Klan and neo-Nazis marching in the streets with weapons, with machine guns, militias now all over this country. So I think looking back, maybe in 50 years, people will say, why did those Jews just focus on Black Lives Matter and worry about that and not look at the larger picture?
Yeah.
So what we need, let me just say finally, what we need are allies, because as always with anti-Semitism, we need allies. And that means not simply a person in the head of an organization, but it means many, many allies, friends and neighbors. It's very hard, but we need to cultivate allies. Certainly, that's as one component of what we need to do. I don't think anyone has the answer to this question, Rich, but it is deeply troubling. But
I think it's a long history of the establishment trying to divide, and this is an age-old. Well, we see it right now in the Republican convention. Trying to divide the groups. I think there's a time for us to support. When the Tree of Life happened, a lot of Black churches stepped up, were supported Jews, and did not first say, "Oh, is there anti-Semitism in this congregation or that congregation? I mean, is there racism in this or that congregation?" There's a time to have these conversations. Now is, I think, the time that we need to, as you say, find allies, work together, do what we can, it's probably a bit more difficult now, as you say, because there seems to be less centralized leadership than in the time in the 60s, in the time of the civil rights movement. Although your dad wasn't necessarily embraced by the Jewish leadership in any case when he decided to march. And as you said, that was a political and an ethical and moral obligation. He said famously, when he was out marching, his legs were praying. And, you know, I think that's certainly become a touchstone for so many. You know, I know your dad also said it's not enough to be against racism. You have to be seen being against racism. You have to take an active stand so other people feel okay. For them, you know, if it's one voice raises, I mean, in many ways, the march from Selma to Montgomery started out with not that many people. And as it marched through, one person joined, then another person joined, and other people stopped joining. And eventually, by the time it reached its goal, there was a huge outpouring and things changed. So I think that was an important moment, certainly. What are we to make about the activism of the churches these days that seem to have embraced that part of it without an ethical background, who are supporting I mean, we're right in the middle, obviously, of Jerry Falwell Jr.'s hypocrisy. There is a place, however, for religious institutions in political movements.
Yes, yes, of course. And in American history, religious institutions have played a central role. And that's something important as a legacy that we have. And in fact, what is so striking is the way in which theology is mobilized as a force against racism. This is Ibram Kendi's point, by the way, in his book, Anti-Racism. Anti-racism, he says, isn't simply being opposed to it. I'm against racism. I'm not a racist, but rather it means being active. What are you going to do about it? He's a professor at Boston University, by the way. So what are we going to do? How are we going to act? And how do we as Jews take on a responsibility regarding racism? And one of the things that might be important for us as Jews is to read some books and discuss and think about what racism means in this country. What does it mean? How does it affect the lives of people? And what do we mean when we talk about systemic racism? What does it mean when we talk about this country as being built on white supremacy, the supremacy of white skin? And do we bring something special as Jews, not only from our historical experience, certainly, and our political experience, what we've gone through as Jews, but also from our religious tradition? What does it mean to think about racism? What does it mean to act? What does it mean to stand in the tradition of the Hebrew prophets? How do we do that today? And I think it's a very important responsibility that we have, because my father used to say, to be a Jew isn't simply to be, it's to stand for. What do we stand for as Jews? And what is the legacy we write for our own lives as individuals and as a community? What are we doing? And in this particular moment, with a horrific pandemic, a horrific virus that's running around this world that has shown us that racism is also a public health nightmare crisis, isn't it time for us to take a look and say, what is this country we live in? What does it mean to say land of the free, home of the brave? This is a land of liberty, is it? If it's a land of liberty, how can it be that some people don't have access to decent health care? And by the way, this is an issue that affects people of color, and it also affects people in rural areas. By turning hospitals into profit-making businesses, the result has been that small hospitals in little towns close. And what happens if you need health care and you live in a little town? You know, I teach at Dartmouth College. It's a little town. We have a medical school with a major medical center. That's very nice. If we didn't have that medical school, what, would we have to drive 2 hours to get to a hospital the way so many other Americans do? And what about education and the way we fund education in this country based on property tax? So in Hanover, where Dartmouth is located, it's a wealthy town, great schools. But if I drive 15, 20 minutes, I see a very poor neighborhood and very mediocre schools. That's not right. And that's one of the fundamental principles of the civil rights movement. We still haven't acted on it. And what about voting? Let me tell you, my mother, who lived to be a very old age in her 90s, didn't have a driver's license, and she shouldn't have, which she was even already in her 80s and 90s. So how was she going to, and she wasn't traveling around the world at that point. Did she have a driver's license, a passport? Is it an official ID identification who she is, this little old lady? Would she be prevented from voting? What is this? What kind of a country is this? If we want to take pride in the civil rights movement, if we want to take pride of my father marching in Selma, what are we doing to protect the right to vote? And look what's going on. What, the mail won't come? This is fundamental to this country. What do we believe in? What are our principles? Now, I grew up, principles where this country provides equality for all people. And then our eyes opened up. You know, it reminds me of the Psalm. There's a Psalm that speaks of idolaters and idols. That says they have eyes but do not see, they have ears but do not hear. And there's a little bit of an idolater in everybody. We have eyes, but do we see what's going on in this country? Do we see the suffering, the inequality? Do we see this? And people are shocked about the lynchings that are now available on video because people have these telephones with a camera inside. They take a picture while policemen kill somebody. But let's remember in this country, the lynchings, if people would go from church on a Sunday morning and go and find a black man, woman, or child, torture the person and murder them. And everybody standing around watching and taking pictures that were made into postcards and that were sold all over the country. So we're not the first generation to witness this murder. Millions of Americans saw pictures of lynchings. We called this pogroms in the Yiddish newspapers at the turn of the century. We were shocked when we came from Poland and Russia and found there were lynchings in this country. How could it be? This is America.
You have inherited your father's fire. It's nice to see. Do you have hope?
Well, you know, this is an interesting question, hope. Because one of the things that I feel I learned from my father was to avoid cheap hope. That is, what he tells us, what my father tells us about the prophets, is that only a person who fully understands despair can offer hope. And you know, it's a Hasidic tradition. When you go to a Hasidic Rebbe and you're in despair, which, by the way, despair is forbidden in Judaism. You mustn't be in despair. It's sinful because it implies that God is not present, and God is present. But what do? You go to a Rebbe. The Rebbe doesn't say to you, oh, you should feel better, tomorrow will be better, some simple platitude like that. No, the Rebbe goes in a process of descent, Yerida. That is, the Rebbe is supposed to feel how you feel, your suffering, and raise you up. It's really only someone who can empathize fully and feel the other person's suffering. Only such a person can offer hope. So yes, we need hope, but hope can only come if we fully understand and feel the suffering. That's our prophetic tradition and our Hasidic tradition. We Jews have something to offer, and I think it's very important from our religious tradition.
Thank you, Susannah. I think that is a great place to end this part of the conversation because we have a lot of questions. So thank you, Rich. Thank you, Susannah, but we'll continue on. What you just said actually leads great to with someone's question. Why do you think your father's book, The Prophets, resonated with so many Black leaders?
Well, you know, I think that the prophets have played an important role in the Black church for a long time. And also in American Protestantism generally, the Hebrew Bible is important. And the prophets, you know, my father said the prophets give voice to the silent agony that so many people experience. They're able to speak about that agony to people in positions of power, because the prophet is not a person who is employed by the king or president. On the contrary, prophet is someone who stands in between the people and the king and speaks in the voice of God and tells us, how do you think God would feel about this, what you're doing? How can you be so callous? Where is your empathy? And remember that the judgment comes to every human being. So think before you behave.
Thank you. Why do you suppose Jewish involvement in the civil rights movement is often written out of history, as it was in the movie Selma?
You're asking me or Rich?
You both can answer.
Well, I'm doing my best to write it back in. I mean, that's really my job. I've done that in this book and others as well. You know, it's always hard. It's always hard to speak to other creators, you know, other artists. Everybody has their own vision. Susannah asked me earlier why I chose to write this book for children. You know, I think children is, you know, I mean, perennially we have hope in children. The next generation is going to be a step better. The next generation is going to be a step better. You know, we have to start young. We have to, you know, I'm always amazed. A lot of my books deal with social issues. You know, I have a book, Busing Brewster, about busing. That when Kamala Harris mentioned it in the first debate, we suddenly had a spate of sales, so thank you. You know, a number of other books that address these times. And I'm often asked, why, when you go into schools, why are you creating problems? You know, children are too young, you know, let them have their childhood. And I want to ask these people, what school they've gone to. Did they not remember being in school? Kids are very sophisticated about right and wrong, what's you know, the right thing to do when they, you know, when they're doing something they know they shouldn't be doing. Kids are very aware of racial issues at a very, very young age. And so for me, I'm trying to put in front of them, you know, some of these stories that I think are wonderful and courageous, to give them permission to, as Heschel would say, step out and speak out and be counted. And yet, you know, no book and no movie is the whole of any movement. You know, I think we need a lot of viewpoints, a lot of, you know, different angles. I think the problem comes in when minority views are not shown, so that you have one or two books or movies that are expected to stand for everything. As Susannah said, Jews don't have, you know, all the same opinions. Blacks don't have all the same opinions. I wrote a book called A is for Abraham, a Jewish family alphabet. And my editors, who were not Jewish, sent it out for vetting. And they could not believe the amount of complaints they got. Every rabbi, every historian had a different complaint. You know, why is it, it's too traditional, it's not traditional enough, he's taking, joking about something, he's not being serious enough, he's being too serious. And that's when I knew I had written a truly Jewish book. But I don't have it right here, but the preface says that, whether you are Orthodox, Reconstructionist, whatever you're coming from, books should be used as a basis to then have a discussion and to go out from that. So if you've seen the movie Selma and you're upset that that Heschel was in effect written out, that's a good way to have a discussion, to talk about, the movie. What was, it came from one viewpoint, what was right about it, what was wrong about it, what you see in it. So, I tend not to be one to condemn any particular work of art and thinking it needs to speak for everyone.
First of all, I just want to say this has been the most amazing conversation. I want to thank both of you so much for being here today and sharing your thoughts. I have a question. What do you say to an African American who knows nothing about the historic relationship between Blacks and Jews? I find that many young people, but not even just young people, just don't have that history on either side, on the Jewish side and the African American side. But
buy my book.
Okay, well, besides buying your book and.
Well, first of all, I agree with you that this is something important, and I'm glad about Rich's book, and I think that we should have more. I know that I have colleagues at Georgetown University who are co-teaching a course, Terrence Johnson and Jacques Berlinerblau, and on Black-Jewish relations. And I think courses like that should be offered at more universities. I think we should, in Jewish studies programs, have allies and friends and colleagues to co-teach in African American studies programs. So that would be great. I think actually synagogues can do this, in JCCs and organizations. Why not? Let's have that. Let's have discussions. Let's have speakers, and foster. This is something important. Didn't we do this also when the Jewish feminist movement started? All of a sudden, synagogues invited women to give a talk about this. And listen to what women were saying, and things changed, and that was great. And many synagogues do actually have relationships with Black churches, work together. So let's have more of that. And I think we should also be reading the books. There's so many great books that have been coming out about racism and about African American experience, and it's really important for us as Jews. Can I just say that this isn't simply something that we as Jews somehow do a favor to African American. On the contrary, I had to write an article for a journal in Israel called Sion. It's an academic journal having a special issue on anti-Semitism. And what I thought was really helpful to me, I started reading books about slavery and the impact of slavery on both the bodies and the souls of Black slaves in this country. And I suddenly realized that our understanding of anti-Semitism could be deeply enhanced if we ask similar kinds of questions. So we have a lot to learn from scholars of racism about how we can better understand our own experience as Jews. So there's something they have to give to us. And it's not simply that we're doing them a favor, that kind of attitude. You understand what I mean?
Yeah.
I also want to make I think an important point here, I hope, is that Susannah and I are of a certain generation and time, but Black Jews who have to straddle both these worlds are an increasing number. For me, one of my dearest friends was Julius Lester. In fact, I learned most of what I know about Judaism from Julius, who converted to Judaism in a class of two, the other being my wife. And I, who grew up with no Jewish education of any kind, I was not bar mitzvahed, I did not go to Hebrew school, and was not interested in it. My wife decided to convert, and she was told that she had to go to synagogue as part of her learning process, and she forced me to go with her. And the first time I went, I saw davening in the first row, a Black man who was also studying at the same time, who I knew only through his first book at the time, Look Out, Whitey, Black Power Gonna Get Your Mama, was Julius Lester. And Julius and I became dear friends. In fact, I wrote his, his memory about him for the Horn book after he passed. He was, in fact, the person who, one of the people who encouraged me to write about King and Heschel. In my adult work, not in my children's work, some people might know that, in fact, my father was a victim of gun violence and died many, many years ago. It's time really to stop this spate of gun violence. But I was writing about my dad and his death in East New York. And Julius, who read some of my poems and essays, said to me, you need to be writing about Blacks and Jews for children. And he also taught me a lot about Judaism, things that for some reason I was unwilling to hear about from other people. I was willing to listen to him. And I think this is a growing population. It is in my synagogue in Amherst. I'm sure it's not in a lot of places, but I think that the numbers of Jews of color are much larger than many of us of my generation understand. And I think that we're going to see a huge shift in.
Yes, and you know what? That would be a great book for you to write next, Rich. Yeah, why don't you do that?
I am working on a couple of things.
We actually have a story coming out in next issue, which is about looking at the term Jews of color, where it came from, what it really means, because it's a very complicated term. It has a very interesting history. So
I also want to ask you, Susannah, just as a pure aside, because I told that Dr. King was invited and had planned to come to your home for Passover Seder, and that was something that was on his calendar. Of course, he was shot and died before that. Is that like is that so, or is that kind of a street rumor?
So I don't think anything could have been at that point, 1968, on Dr. King's calendar and in a set way, because things were moving so quickly. But yes, my father had invited Dr. and Mrs. King and the children to come to our Passover Seder in 1968. It was actually 10 days before he was shot. There was a gathering at the Concord Hotel in the Catskills of the conservative rabbis, and the occasion was honoring my father, and they invited Dr. King to come and speak. And that was an extraordinary evening. And then 10 days later, he was killed. And then just about 2 weeks later would have been Passover. I would say that the lesson for that might be simply, so for my father, it was so important because the civil rights movement exemplified one of the principles of the Passover Haggadah, which is you should think as if you yourself went forth from Egypt. So this is not something from the past, it's something for the present. And since that was so much of the civil rights movement, my father thought it was wonderful for Dr. King to come and experience Passover and think what it would mean to our Seder to have him present. And I think actually it would be great for everybody at Passover to imagine, here's Dr. King and Mrs. King and the children sitting at your Passover table. Well, how would you present the Haggadah differently? How would you think differently? What do you think they would be asking you and saying to you about what it means to them? And so maybe it's also a way of capturing a bit of that civil rights era. I think for Jews of color, there is this terrible double problem of facing both anti-Semitism and racism. But the worst insult is to face racism within the Jewish world, to be a Jew and to face racism. That's horrible. And I think this is a problem we have as Jews that we need to face. And I would also add to that, that there is a lot of anger and hatred, Jew against Jew, condemning Jews for their political position or marginalizing people. I saw this when my mother became a widow. Widows are marginalized. What can we do to overcome that? First, the marginalization, but then the sinat chinam, the anger toward each other, and then the racism that exists in the Jewish world toward other Jews. How does that make sense? So we've work to do.
Well, thank you both. We've come towards the end. We're going to end with one last question. Is what do you think the greatest lesson from your father you could leave us all with?
Ooh, the greatest lesson. You know, what I immediately think of is the Sabbath, because sometimes people would call our home strangers, and they would say to my father, I'm a Jew, but I've never observed anything Jewishly. I don't know what should I do? And my father would say to them, kindle the Shabbat lights, make Shabbat in your home, begin there. And I think out of Shabbat comes a great deal more of Jewish spirit, Jewish teaching. And just as an example, we don't light a fire on Shabbat, and my father writes about this in his book, The Sabbath. And we also don't have the fire of controversy on Shabbat. There were certain topics in my home we didn't discuss on Shabbat, certain political issues. We didn't talk about the Holocaust or anti-Semitism on Shabbat. Wasn't Shabbostic, it wasn't appropriate. And you know, we say when we pray, Birkat HaMazon, grace after meals, we long for the day that will be all Shabbat. That is, every day should be Shabbat. That is the dream, the hope. What can we take from Shabbat to influence the other 6 days of the week? To step back a bit from controversy, from lighting fires with other people, but instead to come together and to have the kind of gentle spirit that Shabbat brings to our lives, and to take that and bring it into the other 6 days. So I would say that I think was my father's starting point with Jews who were hoping to become observant and more involved. And so maybe that's the starting point for all of us today.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you both, Rich and Susannah, for this very important conversation that really is just a beginning. It should not end here and needs to continue in our communities and our congregations. Just to remind everybody that Rich's book that he was talking about today, one of them is As Good as Anybody, and you can go to his website and find the listing of all his other books. Susannah, as she mentioned, has lots of books and articles. Sounds like you have an article coming out soon, and so please look for her online. Just as a reminder that tomorrow's session is at 4:30 with Nadine Epstein, talking about the life of Elie Wiesel. You can go to momentmag.com/Zoominars to register for that. You can also find on our website many more articles about Blacks and Jews, and we will send, at the end of the week, we will send out an email with links to everybody's books and publications and links to articles on our website. So you'll receive that actually probably at the beginning of next week. Again, thank you both. Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, Nadine. And we look forward to seeing everybody tomorrow. Thank you.
Can I just say
Yes,
my
please.
favorite Heschel quote I'd like to end with? He said, when I was young, I admired clever people, but as I get older, I admire kind people. So I hope everybody is just a little kinder tomorrow
Absolutely.
and the day after.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank
Great
you
to be with
so
you.
much, Rich and Susannah and Suzanne and Tracy. What a beautiful talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good to be with you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.